A very good evening, a warm welcome to Dan Really Likes Wine, brought to you by Norman Goodfellows, and welcome to harvest season, because it is very much in full swing. Across social media, photos of grapes coming in and of bunches looking big and bright and healthy, and at the moment winemakers still looking cheerful, not the weariness that will set in as the rest of harvest unfolds, but it is lovely to see another year of wine production underway. And it is a harvest we heard a little bit about last week from Matt Day from Clay & Constantia, who was pretty positive about what is in store. Had a message from Donovan Rahl yesterday, who feels pretty positive. There has been a lot of rain, but they've had a dry spell over the last little while, which helps, and he's hoping the rain will stay away, unlike last year, and help his harvest. As for the rest of the regions around the country, well, in a few weeks' time, once we've got a sense of how the harvest is going, look out for a couple of harvest specials as we get from the winemakers their sense of just how good we hope this harvest will be. And it's one that will be watched by all of us. It's one, sadly, though, that won't be watched by a very dear friend of the South African food and wine industry, and over the last number of years, particularly the wine industry, because his social media excitement, and I use that word very deliberately, around wine was a joy. And many of us would jump online to see what his latest wine was, his latest discovery, and always a kind word to say about a bottle of wine. And that summed up a very kind man. The man is Michael Olivier, was Michael Olivier. I feel like he is still with us. His spirit certainly is, and his memories aren't going anywhere anytime soon, because he left such a wonderful legacy. And today on the show, we're joined by four people who were friends as much as they were admirers, who will recount some of their encounters and adventures with Michael, and some of the very special qualities that made him such a remarkable man, and one who is so dearly, dearly missed after he left us very suddenly at the end of 2023, leaving behind Maddie, his wife, and the kids, but also leaving behind a huge, huge army of followers and people who leapt online, as I did, to keep up to date with his thoughts on wine in particular, but food as well. He also left behind some great cookbooks. I suspect those will be touched upon today as well. And our guests, who will meet in just a moment, cover the food and the wine space, and I will introduce you to them very shortly. Before we go to our guests, though, and kick the show off properly, let's have a quick look at some of the latest wine news. Well, this is the Stellenbosch Wine Routes annual harvest parade coming up at the end of the month. Stellenbosch is generally a pretty exciting place to be, especially during summer, but the streets are going to be even brighter and busier than usual with that harvest parade. The Stellenbosch Wine Routes team are working very hard on that, Mike Radcliffe and co. If you happen to be in the area, or if you're thinking of getting down to the Cape, this might be a good time for it. The 26th, if I'm not mistaken, and your chance to explore. Head along to Stellenbosch Wine Routes website for some more details, and if you can, be part of what promises to be a great deal of fun, even by Stellenbosch high standards. Then an evening at Almankirk. This is next week, Tuesday, and not at Almankirk itself, but out at Norman Goodfellows. This is the Four Ways store, and your chance to meet the Belgians who have brought their love of wine to South Africa, polished it up, and are now producing out of Elgin some really, really great wine. I've got a fair amount of their Syrah, a fair amount of their Chardonnay. They do a really nice selection of wine. Lovely, lovely people, Joris and team. This is next Tuesday. If you'd like to get involved, you can head over to the Norman Goodfellows website. There is a R100 fee. All of that goes to charity. There are food pairings with the wine, and it promises to be a really lovely evening with wine, which if you haven't tried, I suspect you will be delighted by when you first encounter it. And then the Cape Wine Auction 2024. This is the 3rd of February out at Moerati. Once again, I shall be your MC and your auctioneer. Had a great time last year. I think I've done 6 or 7 of these now. It's always a really, really good affair, not just because of lovely wine and great lots and terrific people, but most importantly, because the millions of rand, and it is in the millions, that are raised each year go to a selection of incredibly important causes across the winelands, and mostly to spaces that deal with education, whether whether it be projects like the Pebbles Project, right at the very bottom end of the educational scale, up to, I think, the Pitaji Development Academy is involved. People are looking at vocational training. Across the board, education is key to where these funds go. So come along if you are free. Come out to Marathi, join me, join the Cape Wine Auction team, headed up by Paul Kluver, Raymond Ndlovu. Ken Forrester is also part of that now, Wendy Applebaum, amongst others. And come and join a terrific day. And in fact, our last show in February, so it'll be the Monday just before this, I think that's the 29th of January, we will have Raymond and Ken and Paul on the show to find out what the lots are and where this money is going. So look out for that Cape Wine Auction. You are invited, and I'd love to see you there. Right, on to this evening's show. And while there is a great deal of sadness at the passing of Michael Olivier, I really want to focus on the celebration today of a wonderful life, a very well-lived life, and a life that gave so much joy to so many people, not just in recent years for his writings and his very enthusiastic social media career, but before that as one of the great chefs of modern South Africa. If you heard Pete Goff Wood at the end of Monday's show, he spoke about just what a great influence and what a great example Michael was to Pete when he was a young chef. So there are many people who would be very happy to speak fondly of Michael. We have four of them with us today. So in no particular order, Sam Linsell is a food author, food stylist, and somebody who's very close to Michael. Jenny Crwys-Williams, just a radio superstar who is still an icon in the broadcasting industry in South Africa. Tony Jackman, foodie extraordinaire, currently the food editor at Daily Maverick, who put together a lovely tribute piece, as did our fourth and final guest, Emile Joubert. I must warn you, is sporting a rather severe prison break haircut, but is otherwise armed with his sparkling smile and, worryingly, I believe, a cup of tea, which sounds most unusual. Anyway, let's meet our four guests as we remember Michael Olivier. So to all four of you, welcome. Lovely to have you on, and thank you very, very much for joining us. Tony, if I can ask you to kick us off, just to set the scene. There'll be people who are watching the show who gather immediately that Michael Olivier was a man of no small consequence in the food and wine industry. Give us the snapshot of who Michael Olivier was and why he was so important in our world.
Michael was always an individual and different and stood out. He occupied very much his own space in the world. I do know him more from the world of food than of wine. I mean, I do know him from both. But, you know, I mean, I was first aware of him in the Boschendal days, probably early 80s, and I didn't know him then. I only got to know him in the 90s when I was editor of Top of the Times in the Cape Times. And that was, by that stage, he had opened parks. He'd had Burgundy in Hermanus before that. And the Padang period was long behind him as well. While at Parks, we became friends. My family, we were regulars there. And to the extent, and he can't get into trouble for this anymore, sadly, but that my daughter was, he always said, the only young child he would allow into Parks because she was so well behaved and delightful. And I can vouch for that. But, you know, he kind of, I also don't think of him in the present tense. I can't see him in the past tense. That won't be easy to do. This afternoon, for example, I would, around about 3 o'clock this afternoon, I know I would have got a WhatsApp from Michael to say something nice, something lovely about the recipe I published earlier this afternoon, which happened in this case to be for red prickly pear jam. And he would have said something like, well, at Boschendal that we did this, or at Padang we did that, or so-and-so used to make it in this way. He would have said something about it. And that's the thing. I know Sam Linsell feels the same, that he was very personal. He was very, he was a good friend. He was always, everybody's saying he was always kind. He always had a good word to say, and he wouldn't say a bad word if presumably he ever thought one. And he's just a dear friend who he's sorely missed by me, as well as many others.
The theme that comes through that you've echoed there, that so many people have spoken of, is that generosity of spirit. And Sam, you were a great recipient of that, because Michael, even more than most others, and he was generous to everybody, kind to everybody, but he really did seem to have a particularly soft spot for you, and you guys had a very special friendship.
Yes, I feel completely blessed that I had the opportunity to know Michael. Right from the early days in my food career, when I started out blogging, Michael at that point had a he was blogging as well, quite avidly, but he'd had a lot of experience in food media and cookbook writing. And he was just sort of like a mentor to me and a guide. He was always able to, sort of compliment as well as deliver if something wasn't 100%. He would deliver it with such a gentle touch, just to sort of say, this could be done better, or, just, there was always just this honesty and this guidance, but overarching was kindness. And the thing that stood out for me the most in terms of Michael was the Malva pudding. I know that Tony wrote about it in his daily Maverick article, and very much like Tony, I'm struggling a lot to refer to Michael in the past tense. He was the godfather, guardian of really just the best Malva pudding in South Africa from Boschendal days, from Maggie Pepler. And so many food writers have written about this recipe, myself included. I included it in my first cookbook. We all added a tiny twist to it. And he was always so excited by what people did with the recipe in terms of adding a twist, whether I added pears and ginger on another occasion. And he just celebrated everybody's sort of unique contribution, and that's just through food. He had a deep love and sense of heritage, but was also very, very open for changes and innovation. I think he had a great food mind, a great palate, an incredible chef. He understood flavors, an encyclopedic knowledge on food. I mean, so many times, and even now, it's in this week, I'll be like, why? He's the person you can just ask any kind of food question, and I'm going to miss him for that. He's just was the most special man in terms of food, knowledge, recipes, guidance, friendship.
And he was also someone who loved sharing all of that. And already you've both referred to the messages that you get. I think Emile, that as well. And Jenny, when you and I spoke on the day that we both found out the terrible news, I think you'd mentioned that you'd had a couple of messages with him a day or two before. He was a great communicator, and he loved not just talking to people and sharing time with them, but sharing his knowledge, sharing his experience, and with a kindness that we don't really see all that much of in today's world.
No, I mean, I think one of the words that we need to reinvigorate is kindness. And Michael personified that. And I think when we were speaking, we were talking about his kindness. And in fact, nothing was too much trouble for him. If you phoned him up, as I did, and I said, how the hell do you get your magazine up? Because I'm at sea. And the next thing is he was phoning me and saying, all right, what are you doing on Wednesday? Let's go and have coffee. I'm going to show you exactly how it's done. And that was the beginning of a whole range of meetings that we had at a tiny little cafe in Linden. And when I got there, because I didn't know it existed, the staff were palpably in his hands because they were looking at him. Are you all right? Would you like more coffee? I mean, I didn't exist at all. They were mothering him. But he was also very firm with people, I think, when he felt that they were, it's enough, it's fine. My coffee's fine, it's still hot, and whatever. But it was just that absolute generosity and warmth for me that made him stand out. I mean, really and truly, he had all sorts of talents. Writing was one of them. He had a very, very good palate. But it was the generosity, and I think that's coming across in the conversations that we're having right at this particular moment. So my main links with him were through writing, and as opposed to broadcasting. But he had a very soft voice, and I could never get him to speak up enough for it to have weight, I suppose, is what I'm talking about. But I loved his online magazine. I don't know why more people weren't introduced to it and weren't talking about it, because I loved it. And as Dan, as you say, he never had a bad word to say about any wine or about any person, or probably he might say he hit a pothole, but it didn't mean it, you know. He was just kind throughout. And I was also really, really interested in his cookbooks, because, you know, there's so much choice out there that I think if you, Sam, you probably find this as well. If you can actually intercede and show or share it with listeners or with readers, you can, you know, that's what you need to do, because there is so much choice around. And I actually don't talk about cookbooks unless I've cooked from them. And I honestly and truly, I've got his cookbook here. Maybe I can hold it up and you can see somewhere where I've marked the recipes that I'm cooking from. And one of the favorite ones is an egg curry, which is so old-fashioned that people say, what? But actually an egg curry on a cold night or a hot Sunday afternoon is a gift. And he just had this gift of spreading his warmth through food, as well as through wine, and as well as through himself.
I haven't read this particular book, but I do have a copy of his memoir, I suppose it was, A Restaurateur Remembers, and there is a charming nostalgia to it. A lot of old school dishes in this particular book. It's a lot of fun to read. There's a lot of stuff you can cook yourself quite simply, thanks to Michael's guidance. And it is such a big part of who he was. I'm going to come back to Tony in a moment for some more of those food thoughts. Before I do, you did mention that occasionally there could be a slightly sterner side. I think somebody did get that sterner side once upon a time. Emile, was you, after a little digital rap on the knuckles for comments you'd made in one of your pieces.
Well, he wasn't the first, Dan, let's put it that way. I just want to, the fascinating thing about Michael for me was he encapsulated the hospitality industry. And I think Jenny's mentioned that before, as well as Sam and Tony. Michael was put on earth to give joy to people. And some people do it through music or art or financial transactions or whatever. But he was to give joy through hospitality, through food and wine. And that began growing up on his father's wine farm in Durbanville in the 50s. I'm trying to figure out how old Michael was. He always seemed to be ageless, like somebody out of a Evelyn Waugh novel, you know, this character, this immortal character. And he grew up on the wine farm, and the wine, he knew about grapes and vineyards and cellars from the early age. And he was never showy about his knowledge, but I didn't know his foodie side. Unlike Tony, I worked for the Burger. We didn't have enough expense account money like the Cape Times to go and eat at parks and these kind of places. So I only found about Michael, and I got to know him in the wine industry. And he had a great knowledge of wine and understanding of earth and rural culture. And whereas his father and other relations went to the wine industry, he wanted to take it the next step by encapsulating the hospitality and the warmth and the flavors and the authenticity of farm cooking and cuisine that he had experienced and grew up with on a farm in Durbanville. And he went to study the Cordon Bleu in London, which I think at that stage was, the food culture was nothing what it is today. So he really was, coming back to South Africa, a pioneer in the sense of creating what he did at Boschendal. I mean, Landsrek, I experienced the tail end of Michael at Landsrek when he hosted these cheese lunches for students for R1.50 or something like that, where you can eat as much cheese, have as much soup, bread, and wine as you want. And he was somebody that went out to please people, no matter what he did, whether it was reading something that you'd written, commenting on one of your recipes, or not mine, because he wouldn't comment favorably on my limited recipes. But he created joy, and that's what makes some people stand out in the hospitality industry. And I think in this fast-paced side of wine and food and hospitality, not seldom, but I mean the people who really care about their customers and their audience are not that frequent. I don't come across it all that often, but Michael had those values inside of him. And I don't know whether a great combination, northern suburbs of Cape Town and London, it gave him this sense of grace to make people feel welcome, well fed, looked after. And when he spoke, it wasn't just sort of random gaggling and just for the art of saying. He was a very astute listener. And when he said something, you kind of don't forget it. I remember when I was speaking to him a couple of years back, and I just had a visit to Landsrek Hotel in Stellenbosch, where he'd obviously, I think that's his first port of call. And he asked me, are the lions still there, Emile? And now, if you know Landsrek, there's this one side of the stoop. It's on the Simonsberg side of the stoop, this long stoop, which looks out to the lawn and the other side. And there are these two marble concrete lions. I said, yes, they are there, Michael. I know those lions. And he says, have they roared yet? And I said, well, they didn't roar when I was there, but I don't know. Why? He says, because when he was working there, him and Landsrek being frequented by students, him and the kitchen staff would say, if by any chance a virgin walks past these lions, they are going to roar. And since 1692, they'd not roared once. And he was waiting for the day when a virgin would walk past the lions and actually roar. And the thing about Michael as well, and manners. I like watching people, how they act. And the ladies obviously would be, although one has to, in these days, be sensitive about talking about ladies and men, there's different experiences. But I watched him with ladies and standing up when they would come to the table, seeing that their glasses are filled, when he's not hosting them, just partaking in the environment. He was a consummate gentleman. And those kind of values I hold very dear. And in that way, that specific way influenced me. And he had a terrific sense of humor. I mean, where your other guests were inundated with recipes and comments, I was inundated with a lot of frivolous jokes, humor. I think Michael and I, nowadays only one of us left, but we were 2 weeks ago, still the last two people who follow Benny Hill, this ridiculously unwoke, un-PC foolish British comedian. And whenever Michael came across a Benny Hill skit, and I think Jenny knows what I'm talking about, these ridiculous Benny Hill programs, him running around after big bosomed ladies and so on with that childish face of his. Michael would send me one of these skits and he says, no, that's what life is about. It's about fun, laughing, and in his case, always caring and leading by example. Dan?
That's a wonderful summary of a man who led such a colourful and interesting life, but sadly never got to hear those lions roar. Tony, tell me a little bit more about the food. We live now in an era where a lot of what we see of chefs is through the celebrity chef space, their television shows and the social media accounts they have. Michael was from a slightly older school generation, very much a hands-on chef, a cook as much as a chef. What was it for you that really made him stand out with his craft?
Yeah, well, while at Parks, and that was for 10 years, and I don't know if you knew Parks, but it was a very fine restaurant. And he was never, in that instance, he was never the cook. He was never the chef. He was like your gentleman host, if you like, which picks up from what Emile was talking about. He had 2 or 3 chefs during those years, and he and the chef would sit down together and talk to the chef and say, well, what do you think we should put on the next whatever menu? And they would talk about it and discuss it, and Michael would put in his very well-resourced input into whatever that dish was that they were thinking of. It might have been confit duck, for example. And then they would put this menu together, practice it, taste, redo it, and get it right, and then call people like me, but not Emile, around to taste the new menu and to get our intake, our input on before making a final decision. But the other side of it for me, and more to the point really, which goes back throughout his career in restaurants on the food side, is his knowledge of the old Cape things, the traditional dishes. He knew them all, whether it was, as Jenny mentioned, curried eggs, or as Sam mentioned, malva pudding, or Ruseinkie tart, as others have mentioned lately. People have remembered that, his Ruseinkie tart, but people always remember him as the gentleman host. And I don't know if I have heard him tell the story from the Boschendal days, when Henry Kissinger was there with his wife, correct me if I'm wrong, Nancy, and he was not meant to eat sweet things, and his wife was always on his case about these things, but he kept going up to the buffet to have more of the malva pudding and the other puddings. He wanted to try them all, and he wanted seconds. And basically, he positioned himself between Michael Olivier and the buffet every time he went up for more, and got Michael to keep him talking while he had his extra pudding without his wife watching, without his wife noticing. So these are some of the things I've been thinking about lately, but also that if there were one of the things that I write is every week a Throwback Thursday recipe, which is where things like malva pudding and vinegar pudding and things like that would come in. And with me, I have to research these things because I cook many recipes all the time, almost daily, that I'm doing for the first time. And when it's something that that is not as familiar to me as it would be for him, he would be the first person I would call, WhatsApp or chat to or phone and saying, what do you think? What about this? What's this? He had so much insight. He knew that he had the inside track on all of these dishes, knew exactly how they should be made and presented. And, simple as a lot of people like to say that these old traditional South African puddings are simple. Well, if I publish one, whichever it is, whether it's a malva or a variation on a malva or any baked pudding of my own invention, because I do variations of things, I become inventive with these things, or a vinegar pudding, a sayn pudding, etc., etc. If I publish one of those, it runs, it flies, it gets read so many times, it gets shared on social media. And these things are important they remain important, I know, in South African culture. And one of the reasons these dishes are still important in South African food culture and South African food society and in home kitchens is because people like Michael Olivier didn't leave them behind. They kept them in the foreground. And now it's up to me, people like me and you, Sam Linsell, and others to keep that going. We might not presume to take the baton, and I wouldn't presume that. But there's a flag that still needs to be flown, and we can help keep that flag flying.
I think to have the legacy of the godfather of the malva pudding is a wonderful one, and suspect one that Michael would be deeply, deeply appreciative of. Expanding that legacy, though, Sam, to touch a little more on just the impact that Michael left behind, and beyond just people like yourself and Tony, so many chefs, home cooks around South Africa. He just had this sweeping impact, not just on the recipes he gave and the way he delivered them, but just his approach, the way that you always felt comfortable in his presence, whether you were physically with him or just reading or watching what he'd done.
Yes, absolutely, Dan. I mean, I have to say, and this has to be noted, is that I was part of the late first wave of food blogging, and Michael was very much connected to all the people that started the first wave of food blogging in South Africa. Michael was a bit older, but he embraced technology and he completely embraced social media in the best way possible. So it's got to be something to be said about how he actually started the first, which is now Crush Online, food magazine, which was pioneering at the time, pioneering that he was in that digital space, and pioneering that he was out there on Twitter. That's how we met initially, was through Twitter. And he was tweeting and very active on all social media platforms. So basically, I think it's something to be admired that he understood that to share social media was one of the ways to do it. And that whilst he didn't have a physical restaurant anymore, he was still deeply connected to food and the industry and deeply connected to the next generation. He has supported, and I've watched him comment, support, cheer on myself and everyone in my generation and even a younger generation, just sort of has always been there in a digital space, using social media in the best possible way, which is to connect with a lot of people. There's so many good things about social media, and one of the main things is to connect easily with a lot of people, especially in his later years when he wasn't able to see people physically. He wasn't out and about. He was living in Joburg, but there was always this constant keeping in touch with everyone through social media. And that's something to be said. I think, as Tony said, like spreading the word, keeping up the heritage recipes. He definitely does fit into that realm. But he also was quite open to innovative new ideas. And I think to bear in mind that social media has the positive side. And I think Michael used social media in really the greatest way. I'm going to miss all my little DMs that I got. He would share a lot of memes and things that I loved and would be interested in that go beyond food. He did connect with people very much along what their passions were. He knew that I liked, Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers movies from my childhood, and he would often send me little clips of that. And he knew that I kind of liked watching little kiddie little memes and reels, and he would send me stuff like that. So he was able to connect when he knew you quite well beyond food, and use social media in the nicest possible way.
A big part of that social media over the last few years has included wine. I was looking through his accounts right through the end of December, celebrating wine. And that, Jenny, had become a part that not just we really enjoyed, but I think he thoroughly enjoyed. He loved talking about wine. And we've said he always found the good in things, but he was always able to find a reason why he felt somebody would like a particular bottle of wine. And it was never trying to paper over any weaknesses or cracks. He just genuinely did like to see the good in it, and it was lovely to follow his journey through wine.
Sorry, were you talking to me?
Indeed.
I'm actually I'm wearing glasses that have got something to do with Michael. He trained with Prue Leith at the Cordon Bleu Cookery School in London. And one of my first interviews with a foodie was actually with Prue Leith. And I would interview her in Covent Garden. And even then, Covent Garden was buzzy. And there was a fantastic Elizabeth David food shop. No, not a food shop. It was a cook. You buy pots and pans there. But it was stuff that, people hadn't seen before unless you lived in France. And so, Emile, you would have absolutely loved it. And I can remember going in there and thinking, well, what do you use this thing for? But Michael was part and parcel of that early stage of Britain coming out of the closet in terms of food. And Prue Leith, he and Prue Leith knew each other really, really well. And he was communicating. I think he communicated with everybody he met. I think that he had this, as Sam was saying, just this genuine gift of pulling people together. It's like we're all sitting at a gigantic table on a Sunday lunch, and he is there and he is the host, because we're all talking about his hospitality, about his warmth, but about his connectedness. And social media, I think, is the most wonderful thing if it's used properly. And he did use it properly. And the last time I saw Prue, which was I did a lunch with her at the beginning of last year, and because I did get to know her a little bit, and she with her new husband said, "Listen, I think your glasses are a little bit old-fashioned. Why don't you try one of mine?" And she's now gone into the glasses business. And Michael said to me, he said, "I've seen those glasses somewhere before." And I said, "No, you haven't actually. These are Prue Leith." He said, "Oh, that's her new enterprise, isn't it?" And I said, "Yes." And now I know that he went and he contacted Prue because the glasses are as colourful as Prue is, and as Michael was as well. And those early days, it was also the early days of food on the Orient Express, and that was pioneered by Prue Leith. But I know that Michael, in a tangential way, was also involved with that. The history that he encapsulated and that we are all talking about is, I mean, it really is, I think, profound. And this cookbook of mine, Michael Olivier's Friends, Food and Flavor, it stemmed from a trip that he made to Australia, where they asked him to do a South African buffet, a Cape buffet, which of course he did. I mean, I'm looking at, excuse my, terrible accent, Honda biryani. And it's a lovely chicken biryani recipe, which I mean, I've cooked. And then he encapsulated also new chefs, new cooks, Diane Bibby's Cape Malay chicken meatball curry. And instead of feeling, people get very protective over their own territory, I suppose. But he's embraced all the new, Sam, it's exactly what you were talking about. And I mean, if Tony had brought out his forthcoming book, well, we think it's a forthcoming book soon. Well, quite soon, isn't it, Tony? Michael would have been your biggest fan. Honestly and truly, he would have. And I think we all know that. And I just love the idea of a long, long, long table, maybe at, I don't know, Spear or somewhere like that. And we're all talking but we're not just talking about food and we're not just talking about wine. We're talking about affectionate things and encounters. Like, do you remember sitting in Covent Garden and there was Prue and she was behaving very naughtily. And she was also doing something special with the whole food scene in the United Kingdom.
An extraordinary man who's clearly left so many memories and had such an impact. I'm going to ask all of you for one particular favourite memory, so start preparing those. But before I do that, just on that wine side, Emile, I think what I loved, and certainly something that's influenced part of our approach here on Dan Really Likes Wine, is the accessibility that he gave to people through wine. Wine, as you and I both know well, can be a language that is intimidating to many people. That language was never in evidence when it came to the writing or the words on wine that Michael delivered to us. And it wasn't just a wonderful asset, it was a really important part of trying to take more wine to more people in not a dumbed down format, but in a space that people really could read, understand and enjoy.
He was never a wine geek, Michael. I think he knew more about wine than many of us ever did, but he wasn't on a pedestal about anything. I don't know what his recipe interchanges were like with Sam and Tony and these people, but about wine, he really loved, he was very proud of South African wine. And I hope that, Jenny, I do hope that he encouraged Prue to have the odd glass of Pinotage or Chenin Blanc or Sauvignon Blanc from South Africa, because he was a hospitality ambassador for the country, and wine being such a part of his upbringing on a wine farm, and as a accompaniment. I hate the word pairing. Pairing sounds like two doves in spring or some pairing is, but wine was an accompaniment, an essential part of his Western Cape lifestyle. And his talents as a hospitality person and a chef, and his understanding of ingredients. Wine was just like a part of the whole mix. And myself and a friend of mine, we gave Michael the nickname of Love, because he loved everything. I mean, as a PR, you sometimes have to sell your soul and perhaps send a bottle of wine out that it's not a brilliant wine, but the client wants you to get it out, and you write a press release saying, look, this is uncomplicated wine, just enjoy it. And Michael would come back and say, "Oh, Emile, thank you for that wonderful bottle of Chenin Blanc Viognier blend, aged in stainless steel for 2 weeks. It's fantastic, and it's such an engaging drop, and it'll complement this and that dish." He was just enthusiastic about everything. And as you quite rightly say, wine, and I think it's a subtopic for a show later on when you want to get geeky, Dan, which I know you don't like doing, but I mean, wine consumption worldwide is dropping at the rate of knots, due to people not drinking anymore, or due to people wanting to try other elixirs. But Michael, his way of marrying food and wine and egregiousness and hosting and hospitality. And when I see Michael, I always saw the sunshine, and wine was part of that sun that nurtured his character. And another thing about Michael, I spent some pretty rough evenings with Michael, and he could put it away, make no mistake. And I never once ever saw him being, how can I put it mildly, off cuff, off kilter, or anything like that. He could knock back a good couple of glasses of wine after one of the fine martinis I would make him, which he deemed to be quite okay. And he loved wine. And at his very special service we had for Michael 2 weeks ago, Sam was there. Johan Milan was the main speaker, because him and Maddie's relationship started when she was working in the Simonsov tasting room. And it was just, he'd always been part of the wine. Wine had been an essential part of his life, and he wanted to portray it as a jewel of South Africa, just like a malva pudding or a curry tripe or a curried egg, although I haven't tried the latter yet. Wine was an essential part of what we as South Africans want to express among ourselves and to the world. And I think that you're all talking about social media and so forth. Michael players like Tony does and Sam does, and what Dan, you do, and Jenny, although I'm down in the Cape, so I don't see much of Jenny's work. But you are all ambassadors for South African hospitality, which includes food and wine. And I think you all deserve greater recognition that you do get from the hospitality industry. And Michael, especially, I would like to see a kind of a memorial for Michael, something, because it's important that in 20, 30 years down the line, we look back at people who put South African food on the map, who really lived through the transformation of the wine industry in terms of taking us from a bulk, nondescript wine producer into a state producer of excellence that could hold his own. And Michael was a voice for that. And I think that his passing has made, hopefully, many people realize that and the importance of these spirits who encapsulate what we are keen and fond and passionate about, and who inspired generations to come, because you can never know where you're going unless you know where you've come from. And having lived in the world of Michael Olivier, I kind of have an idea where some of my foundations do lie. Dan?
The memories are obviously rich, and I suspect there will be something coming in the next little while from the friends and the colleagues and the peers of Michael in terms of making that celebration a little more concrete and lasting. We'll certainly keep an eye out and keep you up to date. Just before, I can't believe we've already rushed through almost 45 minutes of the show, remembering this quite wonderful man. Let me get a quick memory from each of you before we do wrap up. Sam, if I can kick off with you. If there was a particular occasion, a particular moment that you don't just really cherish, but also sums up what Michael was all about for you.
Yeah, so he used to always be quite concerned about the fact that I hadn't got married and met the love of my life, like his Maddie. And this is quite a few years ago. And he was always like so concerned about my well-being in terms of my romantic life. And he always so badly wanted me to hook up with someone and have that love. So I do cherish that sort of caring that he had for me around things that were not just food, and that I'll always cherish.
I think that's a wonderful, wonderful way to remember him. And that caring side of him was quite extraordinary. What about for you, Jenny? Was there an encounter, an occasion that'll always bring a smile to your face as you remember Michael?
Well, I remember an occasion where I just realized how vulnerable We all are. I mean, as Emile was saying, you know, you don't know when you're going. But it was an event, a wine event at the Saxon. And I noticed this, the back of Michael going in, you've got to climb up a whole lot of steps. And I could see that he was struggling. And I sort of stepped forward to see if I could help him. And he said, no, thank you. I'm going to do this on my own. And everybody wanted to help him. And the area where we were all seated, or we were going to be seated, or we were standing, you had to go around a swimming pool, up a flight of stairs, and through a garden, and then finally you got there. So it was difficult because he had that bad leg, and he got up there, and he was visibly distressed, but he wanted to stand with everybody. He didn't sit down. He wanted to stand, and he just wandered off and then quietly sat down on his own and had a glass of wine. And then he got up and he was part of it. And I just thought he was so gracious about everything. And I think he allowed himself to be vulnerable, but at the same time not to talk about it and just to rely on the kindness of the people who were around him. And I was very touched.
Yet again, another lovely memory of Michael Olivier. Emile, is there a similar moment for you that sums up our dearly departed friend?
Well, if somebody can cook 3 or 4 dishes, I like Michael's way of underscoring the fact of being authentic, and that stating that something needs to be what it is, and you shouldn't stuff around with it. Milk tart with tennis biscuits and melted butter crust and a condensed milk filling. We laughed a lot about things like that. But I remember him telling me an interesting story. We were at a function once, and somebody on the menu there was courgette carpaccio. And you know, for me, I mean, carpaccio is something that's thinly sliced and it's cold and drizzled or something or whatever. And he says, but you know, this cannot be done. Courgette carpaccio is not allowed to exist on God's magnificent culinary flavor-filled earth. And I said, but why? And he said, because carpaccio is named after the 15th century Venetian artist Vittore Carpaccio, who was known for his expressive paintings in hues of red and white. And carpaccio must therefore always be made from a red-fleshed animal with a slight inkling of white fat, preferably only beef, but if push comes to shove, something like ostrich can do. But something like fish carpaccio and courgette carpaccio, and I don't know what else they do these days, but I can never sit down at a restaurant looking at a menu and seeing yellowtail carpaccio or pumpkin carpaccio or butternut carpaccio without thinking what Michael would have said. He was a stickler for tradition when it had to be so, and I appreciate that because that's the way I feel and the way I think. And he also told me that food and wine pairing is actually, you know, you have to enjoy everything, and everything should be enjoyed together. Any good dish and any good wine go together. And he actually, I read a while back that he said that his last final supper would be a wheel, take note, a wheel of Parmesan cheese and a wooded Chardonnay. Whereas he says many people would think red wine and cheese, but he thinks a full white wine like Chardonnay would be better. So when I did hear about Michael, I was out at Dani de Wet's place, de Wet's of course, out in Strays for holiday home, and had a chunk of Parmesan cheese and a Batelier Chardonnay on Michael, and the flavor still lasts today, like his memory will do for a very, very long time.
What a perfect way to pay tribute to Michael with that Chardonnay and Parmesan. We kicked off with Tony. Let's wrap up with Tony. As per our other 3 guests, Tony, that moment, that memory, that occasion that for you sums up your memory of Michael so perfectly?
You know, the first one that springs to mind very quickly was the day that I met Michael and Maddie together at Park's Restaurant. It would have been the very early 90s. And it was a beautiful sunny Cape day. And I was met at the entrance during the day. So there were it was closed for business. It wasn't open. It was to open a few days later on the Friday. And I was met by the smiling, welcoming face. And that I discovered over the next 10 years was exactly the big, warm, smiling face that would meet you at the door every time you arrived at Parks, which of course became many times. But the other is a series of memories that I alluded to right at the beginning of the show, which was those WhatsApps I get almost every afternoon. And they always said something that you didn't expect. So the third last one I got from him on the 29th of November, braised sirloin steak with brandy rosemary sauce. Have you ever heard of, that was the recipe he was referring to. Have you ever heard of Philip Harbin, well-known early TV cook? He said, rosemary is for remembrance and not for cooking. Love to you both, Michael. And then the last one, a couple of weeks later, 13th of December, love the Durban mutton curry. Your devoted fan, Michael. 3 hearts. And I responded with a smiley face. And that was that.
He has left an indelible imprint on so many people. Clearly, our 4 guests in great measure, but so many more beyond. And the magic of who Michael was, and as we've said a couple of times, the past tense still doesn't seem quite right. But the magic of Michael was that it will live on for so much longer through the recipes, through the cookbooks, through the recollections, and through the impact he had on our food and wine landscape. Tony, Sam, Jenny, Emile, thank you all so much for being part of the show, for sharing so many fond memories, and for bringing to life this quite wonderful man. We've lost a titan of the industry, but he does leave so much behind, and it's great that there are lieutenants such as yourselves to keep those memories going and to take them on. So I will be delving into that cookbook this weekend. I suspect all of you have been doing something similar of late, remembering him fondly and raising many glasses and thinking of Maddie and the family. But to all of you, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. I really do appreciate it. And we do raise a collective toast to a wonderful man. So Tony, Jenny, Sam, Emile, thank you all very, very much indeed.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
So there we go. Yeah, it's hard not to, even though we mourn the loss, to have a smile. It's just what a great impact, what a really super person Michael Olivier was. And we leave you with just a few last memories. The legacy of Michael Olivier, it's not going anywhere anytime soon, remembered most fondly. Before we have a quick look at that, I will see you back on the show on Monday as we look ahead to the wine year for 2024. Amongst our guests will be Siobhan Thompson, CEO of Wines of South Africa, Rico Basson, who is the head of the reasonably new Wines SA, and we'll also have Evan Alexander, the export director of Vinimark, amongst our guests on Monday, looking ahead to what 2024 may or may not offer for the wine world as a whole. So do join us for that. A big thank you to Tony, to Jenny, to Sam, to Emile for joining us on the show today. And we leave you with a few final memories of the legend who was and always will be Michael Olivier. Goodbye.